let's just dive in. Go ahead and introduce yourselves, where your names, where you're at in school, what grade you're in.
I'm Ethan. I'm a sophomore at Needham High School.
And then I'm Frederick, and I'm also a sophomore at Needham High School. And we were both partners on our National History Day project, along with Gavin, who unfortunately could not make it.
Right on. So, tell us a little bit, what is National History Day? What's the project that you have to do? How do people participate in this?
I'm gonna start.
Yeah, so in sophomore year history at our school, anyone taking accelerated, which is the highest level they offer, has to do National History Day. And so what it is, it's a really big research project you do, where you participate in the National History Day competition. And so how it works is I think they give us 3 or 4 months to research, make an outline of the project, and then make a final project. So you get three modalities, or I guess four. You can do an exhibit, so like a physical exhibit made out of poster board. You can do a documentary, what we did. You can make a website, or you can do like a performance or play. And so we did a documentary on the Willowbrook State School.
Yeah, and our topic this year for everyone taking NHD was Revolution, Reaction, Reform.
Mhm.
So we were looking at a certain part of history that demonstrated all three of those aspects, and we looked at Willowbrook and we thought that was definitely fitting to this year's topic.
That's fantastic. So, you spend these months on this project. How did you come to pick Willowbrook in the first place?
Yeah, so we were referred actually to the Fernald School in Boston by our debate coach, which we both do, who actually knew you, and that's why like the primary reason he referred us to it. And so we were looking into it a little bit, and we tried to actually do it, but we got denied by the teachers who kind of review all the requests because they thought there wasn't enough resources available to us. So we started looking for some similar kind of similar situations to the Fernald School, but with more kind of documented histories. And that's where we found Willowbrook, with, a similar institution that also had lots of documentation from the documentaries made on it and the lawsuits as well.
Yeah, that was definitely during our initial research. That was something that like stood out to me was just clearly how much documentation was available from Willowbrook, and being able to physically see that kind of shocked me and also got me interested in continuing to do that research.
Hmm.
Yeah, what did you have any ties to this issue as you kind of felt your way around this? Did you know anything about disability before? Were you drawn to it because of it? What drew you to wanting to do this?
Yeah, like I kind of mentioned, it was just the shock of seeing this, wondering how something like Willowbrook and how many other schools could function in our world. And so really just that, yeah, experience of seeing such like drastic and horrendous events taking place kind of stood out to me and drew me to it. I I wasn't really familiar with anything that was going on during in institutions. So this everything was kind of new to me. I learned a lot through that process as well.
Yeah, none of us doing the project really had much ties to like the disability community. Um, but yeah, once we saw it, we thought it was interesting. A, because of how many injustices there were being committed to these people in these institutions, and so we thought that was interesting and important to cover. And then we also thought it was interesting that we don't really learn anything about this in school. So we thought it'd be cool to research this ourselves and be able to learn more and do this project. Yeah.
Hmm.
I'd love to go into a lot of that. And just as a starting place, a lot of people who probably hear or see or read this have no idea what the Willowbrook State School was either, right? So why don't you share a little bit about what was this place and what did it represent? And along the way, I'd love to know what was the first thing you encountered when you dug into this? Like you probably saw something as the first thing that like you're saying sort of shocked you or got your attention, but what was this place? What did you see?
Yeah, so the Willowbrook State School, it was an institution and it was founded in the late 1940s and ran all the way to, I believe, 1987. So it was post World War II. And a lot of the institutions as a whole were kind of pushed by eugenicist beliefs. And so what would happen is they'd put people with mental disabilities in these institutions and essentially separate them from society. And a lot of it was pushed by physicians who would pressure families into putting their children into these institutions. And then once in the institutions, these kids would be severely neglected. They're often abused, both physically and sexually, as well as like mentally. In the Willowbrook School specifically, there was a massive shortage of workers. Part of this was due to a lack of government funding. And so what would happen is I believe the stat in the documentary was that there was one worker for every 50 kids at the institution. And so these kids were severely neglected. They had nothing to do all day. They were often, they went unbathed, unclothed for weeks, and they just essentially sat there all day with nothing to do. And so, and then another thing we stumbled across early in our research were the experiments they conducted there. So the first thing we looked at when we saw the Fernald School, we saw the experiments with radioactivity, where they'd give the kids the radioactive oatmeal to see kind of how it passed through the body, and what effects it had. At Willowbrook, they were also conducting extremely unethical experiments with hepatitis, because the conditions were so poor, and there was no hygiene or bathing or any real standards there at all whatsoever. What happened is that the residents of the institution, 100% of them would contract hepatitis within their first 6 months. And so what happened is that researchers came in and they saw this and they saw it as an excuse to conduct some experiments. So what they'd do is they would convince people who were trying to get their kids into institutions, often because there was no resources in communities, like not nearly to the quantity we see today. And so parents would be trying to get their kids into these schools. And so the researchers would partner with the school and allow the kids to get in and have nicer dorms and promise the parents a potential vaccine for the virus. And then what they would do is they'd either inject them with hepatitis or feed them the feces of other students mixed with chocolate milk and test the results and see if they could find a cure and see if there are multiple strains of hepatitis. And so, yeah, so that was kind of what we saw. That was what was happening at the Willowbrook School. And then finally, documentaries in the 1970s, especially the one by Geraldo Rivera, publicized this, and the conditions there. And so this eventually led to lots of outcry, both nationally and from parent groups. And these parent groups sued, in conjunction with whistleblowers at the school and the residents, and eventually led to the downfall of the Willowbrook State School and eventually institutions as a whole. But so yeah, when we first researched this, we saw the general story. I feel like the summary was that it was a school with extreme overcrowding, extremely underfunded, horrible conditions, and then there was the documentary, which eventually led to the closing. So I think that broader outline of like less so with the context, but more so just like a school with atrocities occurring, and then a reporter came in and exposed these atrocities, and then finally the school closed is the general thing we started seeing initially.
Yeah, going back to that earlier question of like first thing I saw, I think what if you look up Willowbrook State School, go over to images, you just are flooded with images of patients at Willowbrook. Pretty sure his name was William Bronston. He did a like photo montage called Christmas in Purgatory. So he took a ton of pictures of the conditions inside institutions such as Willowbrook. And so when you go over to that images, you're just filled with shock and disgust at what's kind of occurring inside Willowbrook and these other institutions that I really had no idea about before.
Yeah, like one of the first things you see besides like those executive summaries is the documentary itself by Geraldo Rivera, which has kind of a lot of shocking and unfiltered images of the residents being abused there. So I think that's, yeah, is very powerful, and like yeah, just to come across as the first time researching it, I thought that was pretty interesting.
Do you see aspects of what I mean, this is horrifying stuff to look at, and it's really hard to look at, and to go through it and actually see a story is, I think, what's so amazing about what you've put together is to because it's so overwhelming to encounter these images and these stories. You can kind of lose track of like there is a story to what's going on that you just told very beautifully about how this all came to be. Do you see aspects of stuff from your research in the world today, in schools, in the world around you? Do you see it anywhere? Contours of it or aspects of it?
Yeah, for sure. I definitely think you still see there's kind of like a partition, right? Like we were saying, only our level of classes do the NHD project. So there's always still this level of separation, right? And you have the levels of classes, but then you also have these special ed classes. So there's not really full integration, and you still see kind of some stigma around the disability community, just from kids among this school. So I'd say like even though deinstitutionalization was like a big step forward, it's not, like it's not like the world is all of a sudden a perfect place, even once these schools like Willowbrook started to close. And yeah, I think it's kind of opened our eyes to see like there's still these problems were much, much worse back then, and there's been like a significant step forward, but it's also not fully resolved, and we can see that like there's
Yeah.
still strides to make even today.
Yeah, and even in the research we did towards the end, we looked at what was going on now, and essentially now institutions kind of still exist. Places like prisons function as similar to these institutions housing a lot of people with mental illnesses. So really seeing institutions never went away, they still exist today, is something that's concerning as being part of this research and something that should be concerning to every person.
And I think it's also interesting to see that, like, we just really don't learn about this stuff in schools. And I think it's a really powerful and important thing to learn. And I think that's one of the biggest things I noticed. Like, yeah, it's just like it seems like a very impactful event in history that we really have never touched upon in school. So I think that's probably the biggest thing that we noticed. It's like, why have we never learned anything related to this before?
You have a sense of why? Like one of the cool things about doing history classes is you learn kind of an organized way of how to speculate about things, about how to piece stuff together and make an educated guess to start to research into things. So I know it may not be something that you've researched or looked into, but like, do you have a sense of why, or a guess even of why you think we don't talk about these things or learn about these things in school?
Yeah, to be honest, if I had to like, I haven't been in the curriculum board meetings, but if I had to guess, it's probably because it's very uncomfortable. Like looking at these documentaries, like this is uncomfortable stuff. Like you're seeing these very grotesque images of these people being abused. They're nude. They're like there's like feces all over the walls and the floor, and they have nothing to do all day. And so I think that's part of it. Like people might be afraid of saying like, oh, this might, I don't know, mess with them psychologically or be too scarring or something like that. I think part of it is like the discomfort aspect of it and being able to see these things like it's not something that happened, in the 1300s where we just have, a few like written testimonies. Like we have actual video evidence of this happening. And I wonder if like part of that is people think it's like too sensitive.
And then, yeah, adding on to that, I think really it's just a shameful part of American history. I mean, Jane Curtin in her documentary of Willowbrook added at the end, like this isn't hundreds of years ago. This is people that are still alive today that remember this, that were a part of this. And so how closely tied to American history it is and how shameful it is for America as a whole, who quite frankly just ignored people with mental disabilities, is I think another reason why it isn't taught now in classes like ours.
Really interesting. And I wonder then, like you must all share your projects with each other. Like, what's the response from your classmates or your teachers or family? I'm sure you've shared this with folks as you work on it. Did they know about this? If they didn't, what was their response when they saw this? Because it's a very powerful short film.
Yeah, so I think they all had similar responses to ours actually when we first found it, where they were like first like primarily they were shocked is the biggest thing. And so I think that kind of ties into, it not being taught in schools. I think a lot of people saw this and they just had no idea that it even happened. So I think that was a big factor in it, where it's like not only was it shocking because of how grotesque it was, but also that it was like completely under the radar too. So I'd say that was the biggest reaction. But yeah, I think people enjoyed learning about it and were impressed by it, but were also like kind of shocked and taken aback
Mhm.
about, the atrocities that were occurring.
Yeah, especially bring up the Geraldo Rivera documentary. Every time we mention it, I always got a response like, "Oh yeah, I know Geraldo Rivera."
Mhm.
And like I've heard of him. I've watched the documentaries before, but they didn't really know about this documentary, the history of people being institutionalized. So that was one thing I noticed was a response as well.
If you could add this into the school where it was learned about in some way, some aspect of this disability history, what would be a small, straightforward way to start doing it? What do you think you could do in a high school history class to add this in a little bit?
Yeah, I don't know. I think a good introductory method to it would be kind of, maybe not diving straight in, but kind of talking about doing a lesson about what was happening. Maybe, with some of the images and some of the things and like a description, and then having a discussion and being able to talk through it and say, what are we feeling? What do we think about it? And kind of the stuff you're talking to with us today, I think it'd be beneficial for everyone to be talking about and think, how do we see this in today's world, and how are we like, what can we do to, make the world a better place after seeing this?
I often find it just even talking with folks about like, what do we think a disability is in one room is like, I mean, that could take up hours and hours because we
Mhm.
don't talk about it enough where we actually share an understanding of that. And like, there aren't a lot of spaces to just say, well, I think disability means this, and I think disability means that. And you learn so much from that that we're all seeing the world very differently, right? And so I think that impacts things enormously. Right, a simple conversation could go a long way. You're getting at something I think is super interesting of like like where we kind of go from there. If there was one thing that like schools, as the principal of the school that I was at when I taught high school, he always reminded me and the students, because he had worked in an institution at one point, one of the state schools for the so-called feeble-minded. He would remind us all that schools themselves, even public schools such as you're in, are institutions in and of themselves, and that means they have certain mindsets that overlap. Now you're going into school every day, but you've made this documentary and you've done this research. If there's one thing that we could change about the way that schools are operated or our mindsets are operated around these things that you see based on the work you've done, what would it be? What would you change?
I mean, I think Frederick kind of mentioned this earlier about why schools don't have this. It was like this level of discomfort, and that we in school really shouldn't be talking about this stuff because it potentially makes students uncomfortable. But I think you have to recognize that there's going to be a level of discomfort when talking about these certain topics, and that you have to move past that in order to better your understanding of what's going on in the entire world.
Yeah. Also, like empathy is super, super important. And yeah, like the level of discomfort you'll have having this conversation is nowhere near, the amount of suffering these people experience while in these institutions. So I think that's important to remember and say, even though while we may experience a bit of discomfort, like it's important to recognize these people and what they went through and what that means, for society as a whole, and how we can combat that, to, make sure that such injustices aren't going to happen again.
We've done an extraordinary work, and I think that empathy really matters in that. And I really love hearing that. Like I think there's sometimes a view that we have to do history almost the way that we might think about how we pursue science, and that we have to have it be completely emotionless or without kind of a moral reckoning. But I don't think that's actually even possible. And I think it's better to, like you're saying, accept that that is a natural part of it and confront it head on. The documentary is beautiful. It really encapsulates a very, very difficult thing um, in a very, very short space that could very easily be lost. And I think I'm really impressed by your sense that this can very quickly feel like it's a long time ago, and yet there are people alive and around us like Bernard Carabello, who you feature in the film, who were people who were victims of this, and there are people today who are victims of this who are around us. It's a history that's very, very close to our present. So I want to thank you for doing this. It's really, really important work, and it's impressive work.
Influenced by European models, American physicians began promoting mental institutions in the 1800s. Massachusetts and then New York were the first two states to create separate institutions for those labeled mental defectives. By the 1850s, New York had already built its first large institution. The Great Depression further intensified the growth of institutions. As unemployment and poverty rose, families lacked the financial resources to care for their children in their own communities and were often forced to send them away. In 1939, the state of New York announced that $5 million would be allocated towards the creation of the Willowbrook State School in order to meet the needs of mental defectives from New York City. Despite being made to serve the needs of those with mental disabilities, the Willowbrook State School acted more as a prison. The Willowbrook State School of Staten Island, New York would go on to play a crucial role in the disability rights revolution. Exposés on the atrocities occurring within its walls led to reactions of national outrage and efforts from parent advocacy groups, which eventually culminated in reform. These reforms gave rights to Willowbrook residents and set lasting precedents for disability rights protections and guidelines for experimental ethics. The creation of the Willowbrook State School did not occur in isolation. In addition to financial strain and a lack of resources, the drive for institutionalization reflected a growing eugenics movement and strong endorsement by doctors. The eugenics movement provided the justification for segregation. Alex Green, a Harvard professor and expert on disability rights, explains society's negative views towards those with mental disabilities.
The belief was that any parent who would give birth to a disabled child themselves likely had something, what they would call defective about them, that called into question their judgment and ability to raise that child.
As a result, parents were often encouraged to part ways with their child and discouraged from having more. Institutionalization was primarily promoted by physicians. Pearl S. Buck, acclaimed author and mother to a mentally disabled child, described what a doctor told her in her 1950 memoir, The Child Who Never Grew. "This child will be a burden on you all your life. Above all, do not let her absorb you. Find a place where she can be happy and leave her there and live your own life." These eugenicist beliefs and the medical framing of disability as a burden influenced both private family decisions and public policy, resulting in the creation and rapid overcrowding of institutions like Willowbrook. The Willowbrook State School was publicly portrayed as a place of care and education, but behind this false image was severe overcrowding, unsanitary living conditions, and abuse. The school released only staged images of cared-for residents in newspapers. As William Bronston, a former Willowbrook physician, recalled,
"The system had set up a way that would not allow any ordinary people to see what was going on inside these brick buildings."
Additionally, Willowbrook employees kept the conditions private because they would likely lose their income if word got out. This secrecy helped to hide the reality of life inside Willowbrook from the public. Behind this facade, a very different reality existed. At its peak, Willowbrook was designed for only 4,000 residents, but ended up housing more than 6,000, all while remaining severely understaffed. Geraldo Rivera described the school's conditions in his 1972 documentary.
There was one attendant for perhaps 50 severely and profoundly retarded children, lying on the floor naked and smeared with their own feces.
Bernard Carabello, a former resident and now advocate, described the inhumane conditions.
When they used to give out cookies and candy, they used to drop it on the floor and they all get down and grab it.
Overcrowding caused a hepatitis epidemic that infected 100% of residents within their first 6 months at Willowbrook. Researchers took advantage of this outbreak as justification to conduct trials where they could deliberately infect children with a potentially deadly virus. They did so through injections of hepatitis or by feeding contaminated feces mixed into chocolate milk to determine if multiple strains of the disease existed and if a vaccine could be made. Parents were underinformed as well as offered incentives such as skipping waitlists, being given nicer dorms, and promises of a vaccine in exchange for their consent. In a 1958 letter to a Willowbrook parent, the director of the school asked whether a parent wished to have their child given the benefit of this new preventative, framing the experiments as beneficial rather than harmful. When one parent inquired why tests could not be performed on primates instead, she was told that using animals would be too expensive. Even 30 years later, research leader Saul Krugman still defended the experiments. He wrote in a medical journal, "The studies were conducted in Willowbrook State School because hepatitis was a severe problem, and not because we were looking for a facile guinea pig population."
As the disability rights movement grew, reporting on Willowbrook State School exposed brutal conditions, shocking the public and sparking calls for reform. After World War II, parents formed advocacy groups demanding better services and community programs.
In this county, we have no special classes, no nursery schools, no community or child guidance centers to give our children what parents of every normal child take for granted.
Despite their small numbers, these parent groups drew attention to the conditions inside institutions. In 1965, Senator Robert Kennedy reported
that borders on a snake pit, and that the children live in filth, that many of our fellow citizens are suffering tremendously because lack of attention, lack of imagination, lack of adequate manpower. There's very little future for the children.
In 1971, journalist Jane Curtin publicized the school's conditions, opening her article with a jarring description. The boys in Building 6 pick at the sores on their naked bodies during the endless days they spend on wooden benches, curled on the floor. Nationwide reaction finally came in 1972, when Geraldo Rivera's expose of Willowbrook revealed overcrowded rooms with neglected residents.
Their life is just hours and hours of endless nothing to do, no one to talk to, no expectations, just an endless life of misery. How is it living on the ward that you live? This place.
Rivera's televised footage made the crisis undeniable in ways written reports cannot. public outrage was immediate. One letter to Time magazine captured the public's reaction to the expose. "Sir, your writers were kind enough to call the Willowbrook State School a human warehouse. I am inclined to be more realistic and classify under the category of slaughterhouse." Deborah Weisbach, whose brother was institutionalized at Willowbrook, described her horrified reaction to the expose.
Years after he died, I was in high school when the expose came out, which was extremely overwhelming and horrifying to me. I was confused and angry and just couldn't comprehend why in the world my parents would have sent their son to this horrible place.
The inhumane conditions exposed at Willowbrook State School sparked a national outcry that led to reforms reshaping disability rights and research ethics across the United States. In March of 1972, parents of Willowbrook residents filed a class action lawsuit against the state, arguing that the overcrowded and underfunded conditions at the school violated their children's 14th Amendment rights. 3 years later, the case resulted in the Willowbrook Consent Decree, which required the school to provide the least restrictive and most normal living conditions possible. This standard was based on the recognition that people with developmental disabilities, regardless of the degree of handicapping conditions, are capable of physical, intellectual, emotional, and social growth. The Willowbrook Consent Decree began the transition for people with mental disabilities from institutions to community settings and forced the state to provide resources such as special education classes in public schools. At the same time, public outrage over the hepatitis experiments led to reforms in medical research ethics. In 1974, congressional hearings investigated unethical human experimentation, including at Willowbrook, resulting in the signing of the National Research Act. The act established a commission to define ethical standards and protections for research involving human participants. Its work culminated in a 1979 publication known as the Belmont Report, which emphasized the necessity of true patient cooperation, informed consent, and careful selection of participants. It established two crucial roles that set foundations for all future experiments. Number 1, do not harm, and number 2, maximize possible benefits and minimize possible harms. While families celebrated these victories, it would take until 1987 for Willowbrook to finally close its doors, showing how slow reform can take even after national attention.
Willowbrook transformed from a symbol of institutional abuse into a catalyst for national reform, reshaping disability rights and ethical standards in medical research.